then why do I have one left? It was like on the table.
We need to stop moving our stuff in here.
Oh, here we go. I'm stupid.
Do you have my notebook?
Who'd you have?
Fully don't.
This is your notebook. What the fuck is my notebook?
I'm like recording right now.
Oh, so it's okay. I mean, people can listen to me not finding my notebook.
Yeah. And everyone's fine with being recorded? Yeah.
Can we redact after if you want?
Sure.
Okay. We're good to go.
Hi everyone, welcome to round 5, the last preliminary round of HHIV 2025. My name is David, I'll be the chair for this second debate. Could I get my panel to introduce themselves?
Nate, Nilabh Agarwal.
Oh, are we missing a, yes, we are missing a, okay.
Good.
Okay, in the meantime, we do speaker introductions starting with the opening government, name, speaking position, and pronouns that you want to share.
PM, Caleb, he, him.
Hi, Zander speaking second, he, him as well.
Ben speaking first, you can.
Adrian speaking second for he.
Going first, Nilabh, he, him.
Government with please.
And Seal.
Emery first day then.
Kai speaking first, Adam.
No, second.
Oh, sorry, second. I apologize.
Unless. Who knows what's going to happen? We switched last time.
Okay. Yeah, if you want to switch, just let us know. Okay. Yeah. We'll wait 3 minutes.
Oh my god.
Oh, I didn't actually have
I'm so sorry. It's half glitched and showed me the wrong room at UBC.
Oh, correct. Yeah, I think they redrew it and made it. Yeah. Do you need just a bit of time to set up and then?
Yeah, we can take a couple minutes. We will not be lost for the time, don't worry. I drew some of these panels. They don't
Okay, no worries. Okay, I mean, I think everyone knows the drill, so I don't need to do any preambles. Prime Minister, whenever you're ready, you know, open up the sound debate here.
What is the comparative under our side of the house? We think the comparative under our side is probably one where the state plays a more active role in subsidizing healthcare and making sure it's accessible to everyone. We think that in the majority of countries, where the state oftentimes has an obligation to its voters, we think that this is going to be the commonplace scenario. We think that this could take a multiple plurality of forms, right? For example, governments might choose to subsidize drugs when they're sold on the counter, or perhaps governments might provide credits based on means-tested ways to ensure that more people can access healthcare. The crucial thing to note is that this is incompatible with the existence of IDNs, and IDNs actually undercut the role of the state. Why? 3 reasons. Firstly, as IDNs become larger, they come under increasing lobbying power, and therefore they're able to exert more corporate capture and exert more pressure upon the government to do its bidding. What does this necessarily mean? It means, for example, that IDNs might want to remove state hospitals from certain areas because oftentimes this undercuts the monopoly and prevents them from being able to get a greater number of people in their hospital and therefore negotiate for more drugs. Secondly, we think there's just going to be less accountability on the government once the IDN exists. So for example, once it's demarcated as being within the realm of the private sector, it allows the government to deflect blame on healthcare costs to the IDN rather than actually doing it themselves. The final reason is simply because of entrenchment. Look, for example, in the status quo, where many democratic politicians, even people like Obama, say they don't want to have single-payer healthcare because they don't want to build things up from the ground again. What this necessarily tells us is that once you have reliance and once the majority of people are attached to the IDN, many of them don't want to make a crucial switch because of the huge costs that come with transitioning. For these reasons, we would suggest to you that the presence of the IDNs under their side of the house comes at the expense of the state and the comparative that we have laid out to you. The crucial difference between the IDN and the state is that the IDN's incentive is purely financial, while at least on the government side, you have an electoral incentive. How then do we think that this affects the debate? The first way is in terms of pharmaceutical companies. We think that their side makes researching for drugs much worse and changes their incentives in ways which are pernicious. The first thing they do is that they increase the incentives and abilities to develop other and new pharmaceutical drugs. Why? This is because at the point at which you have to negotiate with this firm in order to be able to sell your drugs, you will actually want to produce more of the drug which is currently being subsidized. Which means at the end of the day, you don't produce new drugs and you actually are forced to raise the cost of other common drugs to ensure that you are able to get to cover the cost of the subsidy that you are giving. Moreover, you're just going to spend less on research and development because at the end of the day, most of your revenue is going to come from this particular source. What does this mean? It means that you're forced to raise the prices on different kinds of drugs which are not the ones that are preferred by the IDN. Given that IDNs have a huge incentive to prefer common drugs, it means that the people that you're going to screw over are the people that actually rely on drugs which are far less common. For example, things like that might not be like things like these orphan diseases, for example, which are not commonly covered by many of these IDNs which want to pander towards people in the middle. Why is our comparative much better? Under our comparative, drugs will be bought by the government or at least heavily subsidized by them, which means that these pharmaceutical companies still have a huge incentive to develop those drugs, since it's the government taxpayer and therefore the wealthy who pay the taxes who are actually the ones doing the subsidy. While under their side of the house, it is the pharmaceutical company which is paying the subsidy, which means that at the end of the day, they have far less money to do research and development with. Now, the second thing we want to talk about are the IDN's incentives, why they're necessarily pernicious. The first thing that IDNs want to do is to elongate treatment, to actually increase the number of patients that they have. Why is this so important for their profit model? This is because by increasing the number of patients, you are therefore able to increase their negotiating power. Notice that on opposition, they're likely to tell you that these IDNs want to cover more and more patients, for example, expanding their reach into rural areas. And that is crucially the same mechanism that leads them to want to expand the number of patients in the areas that they already control. What is this going to manifest like on the ground? It looks like things like symptom management instead of actual treatment. For example, administering more opioids and painkillers in order to ensure that people remain reliant on your healthcare system and ensure that these people actually continue to come to you rather than go to someone else. What this necessarily means is that you like to subsidize many of these bad drugs, which we oftentimes don't think actually solve the root causes of these issues and therefore actually keep these people sicker at the end of the day. So this is a huge harm that their side has to stomach. Secondly, we think that their side actually wants to eliminate competition. IDNs want to ensure that there are no other healthcare providers because these things actually present a threat to their bottom line. What does this mean? It means that when there is going to be new competition, two things might happen. Firstly, they are able to use the high prices that they normally get on a daily basis because it's a monopoly, you don't have any other competition, to raise those prices and to therefore ensure that you're able to use those profits to price out many of those competitors or to buy them up. We think that in the case of patients, this is particularly important because patients are a captive market. They can't just move to a different geographical area because these are the people who are the sickest and at this point in the time, they just can't make this kind of shift. Also, they tend to be poorer, financially disadvantaged, and therefore we think that the ability to be able to go towards other kinds of competition is extremely marginal. So at the end of the day, they make life worse for these groups of individuals too. The final thing is that we think IDNs are going to make political decisions because they want to expand into new areas, for example, conservative and religious ones. And we think that one huge incentive that they have, therefore, is to tamper down on things like abortion, IVF, and things which actually benefit women and benefit people against religious sentiments in many of the liberal areas. So, if there's an IDN under their side of the house that covers both a liberal and a conservative area, abortion is unlikely to be available in both of those areas because at the end of the day, the IDN wants to be politically palatable within the rural state. The comparative under our side is clearer, where at least the states which are able to provide abortion and which are already liberal can have the state subsidize this, can have the state actually back this up, while the rural area will probably be marginal. At the end of this debate, it falls out at the end. I'll take it from.
Do pharmaceutical companies ever lobby the government?
Yes, they lobby the government, but we think that adding an additional actor of the IDN under your side of the house makes that actually much more pernicious. We think that actually the lobbying that occurs under our side of the house is going to be far fewer because at the end of the day, we think that these companies will be spending more on R&D. Now, let's weigh this debate. What we have proven to you, therefore, is three things. Firstly, we think there's going to be more choice of people in healthcare. We've proven to you that there's going to be a wider array of products, types of services, and providers. For example, things like abortion, where it might not otherwise have existed. For example, things like drugs which are far more affordable, where under their side of the house, those drugs will not be invested in the first place. This necessarily outweighs about what their side is going to tell you, because even if there's going to be some expansion of healthcare into new areas, we think that this efficiency is actually a bad thing. Firstly, there's substitutability, which means that under our side, states are the ones who actually provide this healthcare. Even if they do so slightly less efficiently, we think the same number of people are still going to be covered. There are huge incentives for governments to do so. Secondly, you question how good this is going to be in the status quo, because we think that the kinds of efficiency you're going to get under their side of the house are far more efficient treatments that actually keep people within the healthcare system longer. Under our side of the house, therefore, we protect the most vulnerable and we actually ensure that you get long-term benefits because we don't entrench this system. For these reasons, OG.
I thank the Prime Minister calling your opposition.
This House regrets motion. The problem with that is that we needed a much more compelling characterization as to what the likely counterfactual is from the opening government. The main thrust of their case is that on their side, the counterfactual is that the state is going to play a more active role in the healthcare system, which is better for patients, drug prices, research and development, these sorts of things. The problem with this argument is that the premise is wrong. Here's the issue. We won't see IDNs in the first place develop or increase their consolidation on a market in a context in which the state already plays an active role in the healthcare system in the first place. Why is this important? What this suggests for the debate is that this debate is not taking place in somewhere like Canada or somewhere with an already existing healthcare system in which the state plays an active role. The context of this debate is likely taking place in somewhere such as the United States, where the government plays a much less active role in the healthcare system more broadly. Why is this the case? The first thing I would like to note is that in public healthcare systems, the government has a monopoly. The government specifically can use this monopoly to do things like negotiate drug prices because the government is not competing with other insurance providers because they are the provider. The second thing I would like to note is that this means because the government can negotiate prices, there also isn't this countervailing incentive to do things like restrict care. Here's the thing. All of the information that we provided in the motion suggests that these are probably problems happening in the status quo. But because of this analysis, we know that the government is already not playing an active role in these contexts. Therefore, a lot of the mechanism of the government being incentivized to play a further active role is out of the debate. This takes out the vast majority, like the first 4.5 minutes of the Prime Minister's speech, they missed the premise. What's the actual competitive of this debate? Broadly speaking, we think that the status quo means that although it is imperfect, our thesis is that IDNs, because they are big, have a much more significant capacity to do things like negotiate with the drug companies or with the insurance companies to, on large, provide lower prices and better care for the patients. Relatively straightforward case. Why is it the case that the IDNs in the status quo have this capacity? The first reason is that they are large, but the critical component of this is that the way that they are large is that they have a lot of patients within their network. As was pointed out by the opening government, patients just don't move around. Why is this important? What this means is that if an IDN is saying we have X number of patients, probably numbering in like the thousands or hundreds of thousands who all need these services, they have a much better negotiating position with respect to the drug companies because if they want to move, for example, to another drug company, the one that they've moved away from is going to lose probably hundreds of millions of dollars because they are a large buyer. The second thing I'd like to note is that just in general, there aren't like other institutions in society that are buying hospital drugs writ large. So they have a unique negotiating power in the status quo because they have the drug companies as a captive audience in that market. The fourth thing I would like to point out is that because there are multiple drug companies, there is a competitive incentive for drug companies to give a preferable negotiating position with the IDN because of the large population that they would be serving. The fourth thing I'd like to point out is that insurance companies are also going to be on the side of these IDNs because they have an incentive to try to capture that audience and acquire that same negotiating position. So you have the insurance companies plus the IDNs that are working together, and you get lower prices. The final thing I would like to point out is that you have higher government accountability on our side. So to the extent that we, in the future, would like the government to play a more active role in the healthcare system in a private context, you now have these large IDNs that can do things like provide information to the government and saying that we need lower drug prices, and here's a bunch of the negative effects of this are quite prevalent. What changes on their side? Broadly speaking, we think that when you reduce negotiating power by basically chopping up these IDNs into smaller blocks, their capacity to have leverage over the providers of these drugs is significantly mitigated. The first thing I'd like to point out is that then you get a weird context of like inter-hospital competition, because each hospital still wants to have some resources provided to it, but you have an incentive on the hospital, from the hospital's perspective, to pay as much as you can for this. Here's the thing. Now there's an incentive to pass those costs down to the patients, and because open government noted that patients is very difficult to switch their hospital around, there isn't a way to avoid that harm. But the second thing I would like to point out is that there's no significant cost to the drug companies if a hospital is like, you are charging me too much. The reason that's the case is because on their side, the marginal harm of one hospital not buying your product is a lot lower, because there's just less patients that are going to be using that drug in the first place. On our side, at the very least, the fact that an IDN is willing to say, no, this drug price is too high, the purchasing power that they have is significantly higher. And the final thing I'd like to point out is that there's a degree of information asymmetry in the status quo. Here's the thing. Patients, when they go to a hospital, they don't always know everything that the doctor knows. This is probably why they're going to the hospital in the first place. The reason that this is important is because on their side, you don't get a situation where the patient is knowledgeable about the most optimal hospital to go into in the first place, and they also can't there's a sort of a sunk cost issue whereby if the patient is working with one doctor, they don't want to go away from that. So there isn't this which causes a massive harm to patients. I'll take a POI from closing if there's anything.
The info side already concedes that they can negotiate prices, but the question is, are they going to pass the cost savings to consumers, or are they going to use that to increase their profit margins?
Yeah, so on your side, they are going to be passing the costs down to the patients who are going to be paying, for example, higher insurance prices, because the hospital now has to spend, for example, more money acquiring the drug in the first place, which is that's the main thrust of this analysis. What is the overall impact of this analysis? The first thing I'd like to point out is that drug prices, when they go up, this is extremely bad, because I also want to note that drug prices, all drugs, are not always covered by everything. What this means is that sometimes patients have to foot bill for some certain drugs, which is extremely bad because most people don't have infinite money to buy drugs, and drugs tend to be extremely expensive to begin with. The second thing I'd like to point out is that we get more healthcare expansion. As was noted in the info slide, there is an active incentive for these IDNs to expand, but they have the capacity to do so because they have this negotiating power. You can't get healthcare services provided in areas that do not currently have it on their side because you don't have the ability to do things like buy the drugs that would be provided to these areas in the first place. The consequence of this argument is that we get better healthcare provision on our side, and we get lower drug prices, which we think is better for patients and healthcare more broadly. For those reasons,
Okay.
Sorry. I forgot to ask. Do all speakers consent to spectators? Yeah.
No. Okay. Sorry.
My bad. I should have asked before. Sorry.
Wait, can I not be recorded? I'm fine with
Just pause the recording table, and then once the speech is done.
Okay, start my speech in 3, 2, 1. All right, panel, just before we finish up OO here, I want to clarify what my partner Ben said. I think it's really important to the way the rest of this round is going to go. What he tells you is we're in a this House regrets motion. The current state with IDNs as they exist has evolved from some other system, right? We tell you that it is unlikely that a public healthcare system is going to devolve into these IDNs somehow. They give you no mechanism for how that's the likely counterfactual. The much more likely counterfactual that Ben tells you is that there were a bunch of independent healthcare practitioners, a bunch of individual clinics, individual doctors running their private practices, et cetera, that all over time consolidated into these IDNs, right? This consolidation is the current state that we have. Now, I think we would agree on our side that that is not ideal, right? We can make an argument that like a well-run public healthcare system is a better alternative to this system of consolidation. But the burden that we're taking on opening opposition today is to tell you that our current system with the IDNs in like the US is better than those independent practitioners for patients, for the healthcare practitioners, and I will tell you exactly why, right? So why, I guess, does this system work better, right? What we're arguing for is that IDNs are better for patients and healthcare systems than the fully independent system, because right now, with IDNs, you basically have this like triangle of oligopolies, okay? You have the IDNs, you have insurance companies, and you have pharmaceutical companies, okay? So they are all run by massive corporations, right? They're all largely oligopolies, and they all have certain degrees of leverage over each other, right? For an IDN, they are the healthcare providers, right? Insurance companies, for example, are likely to want to sign up the best IDNs so that they can market their insurance as having access to great healthcare, right? Similarly, IDNs are going to want to get good insurance companies because if people don't have insurance in the US, you basically can't access healthcare because it's so ridiculously expensive at like sticker price, right? Similarly, between IDNs and pharmaceutical companies, right? IDNs, again, being the healthcare providers, the pharmaceutical companies need to sell their drugs to someone, so they need to have a certain amount of IDNs on board. Therefore, if all of the IDNs are negotiating for lower prices, it is likely that they're still going to have to pick some of them, right? They're going to have to go to some of them. It is going to force these pharmaceutical companies to lower their prices. The counterfactual with these independent practitioners is you have a bunch of like independent practices, independent pharmacists, independent doctors who do not have the ability, the time, the money to do this same negotiation with the insurance companies or with the pharmaceutical companies. So what would happen is you would see a world in which these insurance companies and pharmaceutical companies, so insurance, for example, can just like drop their payouts a bunch for what they would be giving to these doctors because there's no like nobody arguing or nobody debating with them, right? The doctors need to cover some insurance because, as I already mentioned, they need patients need insurance to be able to cover their cost of healthcare. And similarly with the pharmaceutical companies, right? One doctor in freaking Alabama is not going to be able to negotiate to lower the cost of drugs for their patients because they just don't have the leverage to be able to do it. So what we tell you is that this consolidation, it happened for a reason, right? It happened because of exactly what I tell you, where these independent practitioners were not able to make the business case work because they couldn't negotiate with these other oligopolies that exist. OG is not able to just fiat the fact that we're just going to take over the whole system, have like public insurance, public healthcare, public pharmaceuticals, or even have like the public healthcare system negotiate with pharmaceutical companies. That is not a reasonable kind of factor. Yeah.
The government's role in the healthcare system was once limited in every country. The relative comparative under our side is that people will exert more pressure on the government without the IDNs providing a lackluster version of that service.
Yeah, I don't think that's necessarily true. So let's talk about like the government as an actor in like the world that we lay out for you, right? So in the counterfactual here that we're talking about, where you have these like all these independent different providers, right? There is no real influential actor to lobby the government, right? There is no big IDNs that can go and lobby for healthcare-friendly policies with the government. They're just all these individual practitioners who don't have any power as a mass, right? Whereas the pharmaceutical companies and the insurance companies still exist as these oligopolies. They're still able to lobby government to make sure that their business advantage is still kept in the market, right? On our side of the house, you at least have these like countervailing corporate forces that are able to somewhat lobby against each other. We think the ability of the people to advocate for something like public healthcare is pretty limited in either situation, right? I think it's essentially a wash, right? Either way, people are kind of getting fucked over by like high healthcare prices. We are arguing that ours are lower, but regardless, you're going to have large corporate interests that are fighting for the preservation of the system on either side. Gov does not do enough to tell you why the government is suddenly going to change their mind on their side of the house. Yeah, sure.
Most people live in rural areas. How many hospitals do you think you'd expect to find in a rural area?
Yeah, I think like the amounts are going to be limited, but still to some extent, like there are multiple large IDNs that still exist, right? They have smaller clinics that can go out into these more rural communities. They're going to want to compete with each other for kind of like the tax or the like control of these smaller areas. And additionally, as I mentioned, you have insurance companies keeping them in check to some extent. An IDN can't charge whatever they want because the insurance companies still have to sign contracts with these IDNs, and they're not just going to pay out massive amounts of money for no reason. Right? So let's actually real quick address the COPOI, because I think this might be the case, about not passing on cost to consumers, right? As I tell you, there's still multiple IDNs competing for a limited number of insurance companies, and also a limited number of doctors, right? Doctors are a very valued profession in the US. There aren't an infinite amount of them. With there being multiple IDNs, they do have to compete with each other to have competitive salaries. And we see that in the US right now. Doctors are extremely well paid because there is competition between these multiple IDNs to get them in, as opposed to on their side of the world, where these doctors are having to, are largely running their own practices and are having a ton of their money go out to these insurance and pharmaceutical companies. Essentially what we're telling you is that a larger envelope of money in our side of the world is making it to the actual healthcare delivery stage and not getting stuck at the pharmaceutical and the insurance levels. So let's address some quick things from OG here. So we told you that like IDNs exist because of consolidation, not because of government, right? Let's say if we take them at their very best and assume that like government would advocate for lower prices on behalf of these like independent practitioners. There's still a ton of lobbying influence from the pharmaceuticals and from the insurance companies, right? There's no mechanism for a government like in the US to be lobbied. And we've seen them be lobbied by these pharmaceutical companies time and time again, right? Even the most like bare bones legislation of like the price of insulin is still attacked like recklessly by, or like without like, they just attack it very aggressively, especially from like US pharmaceutical companies who then come and say like, oh, you're putting us under threat because you're like not allowing us to charge full prices to like all of this like Swedish pharmaceutical company, right? The lobbying is still going to exist on either side of the house. What we tell you is with the IDNs, at least there is somebody providing this kind of countervailing force. And then they tell you that drugs are still expensive because IDNs are only choosing certain drugs, like the 2 out of 5 thing. And I guess a misunderstanding of the info slide, I think I was more talking about is there could be like 5 different brands of drugs, like generics versus brand name. What we tell you is that IDNs are able to negotiate, play those pharmaceutical companies off each other to get lower prices for you. Panel, it's a mitigatory case. We are arguing that this consolidation has led to at least lower prices for patients and for their crowds.
Thanks to Deputy for the leader of opposition, call member of government.
Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I can tell that they really care about cheap drugs because they were on them while they were writing their case. I think this entire debate essentially boils down to a wash in the front half about who essentially makes drugs cheaper for who, which institution is able to negotiate for what. I don't think I care, or I don't think we should care about whether that's what the debate is actually about. This debate inherently boils down to structural causes as to why IDNs inherently push out independent providers and reduce competition within healthcare, inherently making the quality of care worse for all consumers. I think inherently this drug kerfuffle is going to sort itself out. Insurance companies and corporations know how to negotiate with each other in a way that's feasible for everyone. The people that are most vulnerable are the ones that we care about, which is the end consumer that needs this quality of care. Let's think about our framing for a second. I think we will first prove to you why these IDNs are most likely to not face competition, then why independent providers are likely to face the boon of this, why they kick out independent providers, and why this inherently makes quality of care so much worse on the side of government. Let's get started. Why do IDNs not face competition? One, I think they exert massive amounts of switching costs. This is really important. When you have a vertically integrated supply chain, you can essentially make sure that it's really hard for your consumers to break out of that ecosystem. This is like when basically they will recommend or prescribe specific drugs that only their pharmacies provide. Second, file transfer won't be possible unless you go to a clinic that's also under the same IDN network. So now consumers are like, oh wait, should I actually switch or not? Because otherwise I'll have to communicate the same facts to the next hospital I go to. Third, like credible referral or recommendations. If my doctor tells me to go to a second clinic, which is like built in the IDN network, I'm much more likely to trust them and not go to an outside clinic. All of those things are just illustrations of what those switching costs are like. As a consumer that already doesn't know much about healthcare and they admit that there is information asymmetry, I think that inherently means consumers are more scared of switching out of that network, of switching out of the IDN. What this inherently means is people are logged into that one IDN ecosystem and it basically shuts down any kind of competition. Secondly, I think there's regional monopolization within IDNs. IDNs are smart corporations that are doing go-to-market analysis and figuring out specific regions that they want to enter. There are strong disincentives to enter regions with existing IDNs because someone else already has a first mover advantage. Even if we buy that there might be some IDNs that are competing with each other, I think largely they play a coordination game because they both know what's at stake here. And largely the only person that suffers is the independent provider in those remote areas, and that's the one that we're going to basically point out the impacts of. Third, I think there's capital accumulation. The point of an IDN is you basically retain more of your margin across several steps of the value chain, right? Like across every step of the supply chain, you hold on to a little bit of the margin. And that's the point of vertical integration. The thing with keeping more profit is it gives you a few abilities. One, you can deploy capital on legislation or lobby. They say like, oh, the government doesn't lobby with IDNs. I think this looks like different on a more localized level, right? It means that getting permits and like land permits processed faster. I think it means like licenses issued quicker. I think it means you can sign deals with like stratas and like real estate developers to basically make sure most of the units and prime areas are reserved. I think those are things in which you can like lobby institutions because you have a lot of capital in one place accumulated. I think that's what it looks like, and that's how you basically fend off competition. Second, I think, and this is really, really important, they're not as sensitive to consumer choice. The fact that I have a diversified portfolio of offerings across a vertical supply chain, the fact that I essentially make sure that I have big capital accumulation means I don't care if I piss off certain consumers. I don't care if there is a little bit of competition in certain segments of the supply chain. One, they're more likely to endure any kind of demand shocks that exist within the economy. Two, they're more likely to be okay with essentially passing some aggressive policies. If my pharmacy isn't doing so well, at least my clinics are still performing. This essentially means you're able to retain more of that market power in the long run because you just don't care about consumer choice, and that's the vehicle that actually enforces competition. It's consumer choice. If you don't care as much, it doesn't matter. Third, and most importantly, you create barriers to entry. The minute I'm able to accumulate capital, the minute I essentially have this massive consolidation, I make sure that I can enforce things like short-term predatory pricing, right? I'm the only one that's getting these like negotiated insurance rates. Why can't I sell those drugs at a discount for the short term until I basically make sure everyone else has to shut down shop, right? Secondly, I think you can run things like exclusivity clauses where you tell certain pharmacy suppliers that, hey, we are the only one you're supplying to within this region. You don't supply to any other pharmacy within this region. Third, non-competes for like doctors and nurses, right? Like, hey, you only work with like this IDN, you only work within our network in this region, you cannot compete with anyone else or like work for anyone else outside. These things exist in status quo. I think that's what's going to happen with the IDN. That's how they make sure that no one else can basically provide. The point is, none of the independent providers have access to any of these mechanisms, which inherently means that they either have to roll up and join the IDN or they go out of business. What this essentially means is that the quality of care decreases. Why? Two reasons. One, I think independent clinics provide more personalized care. You work specific to patient needs, not for some like stupid corporate policy. This is uniquely important because of three reasons. Before that, I'll take opening.
This argument only works if patients have the knowledge and capacity to switch doctors and hospitals, but most patients can't do this, so there's no incentive for healthcare providers to compete for better service, which we recognize.
The issue with this uniquely is that IDNs hold more market power even if patients don't have complete and full information. The point is not that the patient will not switch in 90% of the cases. The point is the patient literally cannot switch if you create massive switching costs for them. On our side, independent providers still provide a higher level of care. So even if, and I'll explain this to you in a second, even if patients don't switch, we are guaranteed that the higher quality of care ensures there's no predatory treatment for those patients. Three reasons why personalized care is uniquely important. One, nature of healthcare means that all bodies are different. You need to cater to specific individuals. Second, I think think rush decisions are really bad. There are many diseases where symptoms look somewhat symmetric but end up being really, really different diseases. If you go according to a checklist or you go according to a standard that is really rushed, it essentially leads to worse care. Third, I think emotional insurance is actually a bigger part of care. If you provide a quality of care that's largely impersonalized, that affects how patients seek or how much they feel cared for, and inherently affects their rate of improvement or their general perception of how well they feel. Second, I think there's more accountability with independent providers because it's based on they're based regionally, right? Like an independent provider is probably a doctor that's from that remote community or whatever. This means that they face reputation claims, they face relationships within the local town or community, and also they just are more altruistic because they're independent providers instead of some corporate profit maximizing institution. What this means is their head is on the chopping board, they care about their personal impact. Now their hands are tied when they're under the IDN because they will have to stick to the policy, they will have to stick to the policy or hide behind the policy if things go awry. Or generally IDNs employ temporarily nurses or do efficient labor allocation, so you never build relationships with your healthcare provider. I think there's no way to pursue accountability against IDNs because they have massive legal teams, and in general independent providers are the only ones with soft checks because we prove quality of care. Please slide.
There will be 2 points of extension from closing opposition. First, access to better care for the reasons of A, communication and access to in-network specialists that you're barred from on government side. And secondly, how having a large amount of data that can be used both in-house and by broad research companies, which we will prove, leads to solvency for medical issues that doesn't happen. If from closing opposition we are able to actually prove that not only is healthcare better, but people are having more solvency for their issues, I think we win this debate. Extraneous responses to CG, I think the bulk of the issue with their extension is that they never prove that small hospitals have the comparative resources to compete with something as large as the IDNs that we're talking about on our side. Insofar as if you're a small hospital, you may have only 2 doctors, 2 or 3, less access to support staff because your funding isn't coming from a larger corporation, less ability to call other physicians in if you need to work longer hours, for example. That means that you can't share the load, which means that it's probably harder for these people to get the care that they need. Opening opposition does not explain why negotiating lower prices is possible in absence of competition. I'm going to do that briefly, and this is going to tie into our first point. And I think if we're able to prove why we still get good prices on our side, we should be both over opening government and opening opposition. First is that you're also competing not just with small hospitals, but with other IDNs that exist. When you're going into a new location to buy out a hospital, your sales are incorporating, in most cases, the opinions of the local community. This is because in order to have a successful hospital, you need to have government zoning permits, you need the state to cooperate with your licensing, and third, you need local government coordination between other people like the fire department or the local ambulance places as well. You can make the case, therefore, that it should be your IDN that's going into this area if you have a comparative reputation that's better than other IDNs. So, for example, if people are saying, I'm getting bad care from this IDN in this specific municipality, in this specific location, you as local officials are likely to take that into account when you're deciding which one you want to partner with. The same thing is true for when the hospital people are going to be selling these to these individuals. I think insofar as they also have pressure internally from doctors who tend to become doctors because they care about the health of other individuals, this means that they're incentivized to try to make sure that it's going to be a continued good amount of care for these kind of people. Bad reputations ones will not be allowed in. In terms of this being a regrets motion, I think it's very easy to say from closing opposition that we know there is a large existence of IDNs that compete for these kind of things. For example, you have Providence, you have Mount Sinai, you have Advent. All of these IDNs exist in the status quo and want as many consumers as possible, which means they know that they need success in order to expand. It's predicated on them having a good reputation because that is when they have an amount of consumers that are also willing to buy into the hospital in that location instead of protesting and not being willing to go as often. I think the best government response to this is that they can collaborate to increase prices. However, you get more customers from another one that you are competing with if you do lower your prices, which is why that happens on our side. First point of extension in terms of ease of treatment. I think for most people who have health issues that are not just you're going to the doctor for your annual checkup, which I think are going to be the most important people in this round insofar as they have a health issue that's impacting their quality of life to a larger degree, you're not usually just seeing your GP. You're usually also working with specialists, either in-house or out-of-house. So for example, if you're someone who has mobility issues, you're also seeing physios. If you're someone who has cancer, you're also seeing people who are going to provide you with chemotherapy. The issue with this is on Gov, you need to outsource to an entirely different facility in order to access this kind of care. On ours, this happens in-house because you have IDNs that are going to be creating these own departments. Why is this better? First of all, this is going to be in-network with your insurance. So if you're already working with that doctor, that means that this is probably something you've already figured out paying for your insurance for. I think it's very difficult if you're someone who needs to contract outward. If the only physio in your area does not take your insurance, you're kind of screwed. That means you're not able to get that care anymore. Secondly, I think there's much better ease in terms of sharing of information that happens internally. This is for a couple simple reasons. First of all, you just have an existing software system that means you're collating your notes in a way that is very clear and it's going to be very easily readable because it's a software system that other people have engaged with previously. It's the one you're probably using throughout this facility. This means if you're going to a different specialist within that facility, they have access not just to the notes that's being sent for your initial scans, which is the reason why your doctor sent you there, which is what happens on Gov. They have access to your entire patient history. Not only this, but that individual is far more better equipped to collaborate with your GP on your litany of health issues in order to make sure that your care is going to be most comprehensive. I'll take you later to what you actually need. For example, I have both scoliosis and I have a heart condition. My physio may recommend that I need to do certain things for my body that my heart condition may preclude me from doing, for example, running all the time. If I don't get that advice, if I'm getting contradictory advice from these two people, they don't have the same notes on what those conditions are, they can't offer me the best kind of care. When they're able to talk to each other, because they're working comprehensively on this plan, that's when I'm actually able to access the care that I need in order to live a better quality of life. This never happens on-site governance because of the fact that there are going to be stuff there. The other reason that you're likely to get better care is internal accountability. So if you tell your GP, this specialist isn't working out for me, they probably have more that are available. They know what ones are available and when may be a good fit for you. It also means if a specialist is doing poorly and you tell your GP that, they're likely to report that to their supervisor to have notes of who they're going to refer you as a patient to next time or other patients to, and they share this feedback internally with the division. You as the specialist see this information, you incorporate into the way that you're going to be treating patients in the future. Why do we incentivize these norms and why do doctors want to be good? I think first of all, most doctors have public ranking systems. If you go online and you type in your doctor's name, you're going to see stars next to their name, which is why you want to do a good job. And they also want to have good feedback internally, so if they're going to be up for pay raises, if people are talking about this internally, that means that you're actually able to get that. Before I go into data good, which of course I'm doing in 6 minutes,
Your analysis about the network effects concedes that IDNs must have a lot of patients and a lot of hospitals, which concedes firstly the elongation of treatment and opioids, secondly monopoly and denial of cost.
Opioids are from pharmaceutical companies that exist on either side of the house and are going to be telling the government that they don't want to be these prices on either side of the house. But I think I'm going to come over this with the data. Kyle will hopefully do some more experience responses if necessary. Big data good, sorry you're out of time. The IDN has so much data. If you are a giant hospital that exists in so many places, servicing thousands of patients, that means that you're able to, and you're doing this in a way where it's a specific system, that means you're able to actually get solvency for a lot of people's health issues. So patients who have niche health issues that are new, like long COVID, there's not much research on, or things that are working for out-of-the-box treatment for cancer, for example, you're able to get a lot more access to information about these when you partner with IDNs to get this. So in the status quo, most hospitals contract with researchers using anonymized data in order to make preliminary studies. I also think internally this happens because if you are a large hospital, you probably have doctors that are interested in doing their research. Maybe they'll need to do a continuation PhD, for example. If they see that they're able to get this data from the hospital, this means that they can do a lot more research on this. I want to say that this is so important because of what the comparative actually is. Individual hospitals can never pull that data in the same way. Even if you as a researcher contract with many individual hospitals, the data is structured differently. For example, your pain unity rated on a scale of 1 to 5 versus 1 to 10. This structurally makes it very difficult to have long studies about what these issues are.
Thank you, member of opposition. Calm government witness.
Such drama.
Ready? I want to deal with two things in this debate. Firstly, what we should care about in the healthcare industry, and secondly, what competition actually looks like. The first thing I want to do is take top half cleanly out of this debate. Drug prices, which both opening opposition and opening government terminalize on, are not the end-all be-all of healthcare. They're not even the plurality of the things that healthcare workers provide. We have a few reasons why we should not consider drug prices as the most important impact, and we should consider our impact as more important. Firstly, is that the most common procedures are actually drug-free procedures. So a checkup where you go to just see if you're doing okay, prenatal counseling, genetic screening, disease screening to see if you're at high risk for certain things, general surgeries and procedures. All of these are done without immunizations. All of these are done without huge amounts of drugs. These are the most common sorts of things. Secondly, is that the most frequent procedures rely on drugs that are generics and not incredibly expensive as they characterize. Why is this the case? Firstly, is that many of the most common procedures have been developed for decades and decades, which is why, for example, pneumonia can be treated with doxycycline, ceftriaxone, amoxicillin, etc., right? Many different drugs can treat the same type of disease, and so hospitals already pick the cheapest drug, but also, very importantly, is that there are just many generic producers, and many of the most common things, again, are already generics. Things like painkillers, ibuprofen, opiates, etc., all of these are generics. The only time they access their impact is in the very niche case, where there is a drug that only one pharmaceutical company has access to, which means it only really unlocks in the vast minority of cases. I want to say, thirdly, is that drug development on either side of the house is likely influenced by much greater forces like the state's incentive to fund public research or universities, or the profit motive of these pharmaceutical firms. So the margin of what the negotiation looks like on drug prices on either side of the house, again, very unclear coming from top half, is not very clear to me on how it affects the people who need these drugs. Again, do they really need these drugs? Is this the most important thing? Or the innovation that we're getting from opening government? Drug costs affect a niche part of healthcare. Comparatively, everybody has to interact with doctors or the healthcare system writ large. So when Nilabh tells you that these IDNs have huge incentives to do things like understaff an ER because it increases their profit margin, or to tell their doctors in the network to rush your interview, to get through as many patients as possible, to stack another person if you can. This means that people are less willing to go to the ER in the first place. They're less willing to access healthcare. It also means that the doctors are just slightly less able to get the full history of the patient. They're less able to, because again, the incentive is to maximize people within your network. They're less able to build long-standing, longitudinal relationships with their patients where they understand and connect with them and learn about the entire life context of that patient. And the importance of this is that this is actually where a lot of disease and a lot of harm happens. Because if a patient and a doctor do not have good rapport, then the patient is less likely to stick to the treatment plan or actually accept the prescription, or to believe them when they're saying, hey, this lifestyle change is really important, or to say, maybe we can work on this exercise plan together. They're much less likely to do that when they're rushed, when they're understaffed, and when they're in this network. Okay, what does Nilabh give you? Nilabh gives you a very important key set of mechanisms on why competition is reduced on their side of the house, and why this ends up fucking over the quality of care. The two I want to focus on is that there is huge amounts of switching costs, and why there is a huge barrier to entry. We've already covered switching costs. People are not really willing to move into different areas, basically, once you're part of the network. Once you have that family physician, once you are in the system, you're really unable to switch over to an IDN. This limits competition. But also, on the barriers to entry in this market, it's very difficult to compete with an existing IDN, or to compete in general, because if you are a clinic, you can't afford a fucking MRI machine or a CT scanner. These are multi-million-dollar investments. The infrastructure is incredibly expensive. And so once you are already established, once you already have most of the city or most of the region under your control, it looks quite grim for competition in the future. What does this look like on the rural level, where there are 1 or 2 hospitals at most, where there are only 5 or 6 primary care places? Now, Humam, you might be asking me, what's the comparative, right? Why is this actually comparative if it is so true that there are barriers to exit or barriers to switching? The comparative is that in most of these small regions, and also regions everywhere, you still have maybe 2 to 3 different internists. You have a cardiologist you can refer to. On their side of the house, you have one internist who is in that network. You have one cardiologist who who is in that network. They're unlikely to hire superfluous or many multiples of people when it is not necessary. On their side of the house, they have one pharmacy that they will send you to that operates under their system. But on our side of the house, you have Walmart or Shoppers or whatever other pharmacies that you can go to. So yes, competition is limited on either side of the house. We think it is much more limited and limited into the long term, especially at the point that they're able to consolidate power, build up their network, and then can make the decisions that then fuck everyone over later. Before I go on, opening.
If you're an independent clinician who wants, presumably, to access the vast majority of patients who have insurance coverage, how are you going to make sure insurance pays you out reasonably when you have zero leverage?
I don't understand it, Joe. I'm sorry. I feel like the problem here is that, yes, the info site concedes that you're going to have negotiation on drug prices. You're going to have negotiation on insurance. But the problem is nobody proves where those savings actually go to. So you tell us that the profit goes to consumers. If you buy our extension on competition reducing, then it's very unlikely that that happens, especially into the long term. They tell us, for example, again, that IDNs compete with each other. I want to quickly deal with this. There are a few reasons why that's not the case. Firstly, in most rural areas, you're simply unable to compete with large IDNs. Secondly, is that even if there is competition within that region, you're unlikely to race to the bottom on price or race to the top on quality, again, because of all the mechanisms we explained. And then lastly is that these companies can collaborate, they can work together, so on and so forth. Okay, dealing quickly then with the CO extension. I think, firstly, on this idea of sharing information, yes, it is better that doctors share information. Doctors do this in the status quo. They can fax over blood results. They can fax over, any sort of information about the patient's past history. Unclear why you need to be in network to be able to contact other doctors. Secondly, as if you need to access the IDN, it is in the IDN's interest to allow you to refer to them. So if the cardiologist is only in the IDN, then yes, you can refer to the cardiologist. Sharing information. Data is not the tipping point to research. First of all, there are data privacy laws, so most patients are likely to opt out of this. Secondly, is that most of the information on things like genetics or screening, etc., are kind of useless for diseases. The most important factor to diseases is like your environment and your lived situation, etc. I think competition is worse is on their side of the house. I think we have a better, quality of care on ours. Sorry.
Well, today I call the whole competition.
I'm gonna take this off, sorry.
No.
Can't afford to style.
Yeah, extra speaks if you keep it.
Okay, fine, I'll do it.
wait.
I forgot a whole page of my voice.
I'm gonna sit because
I'm emotionally devastated by this.
Sorry. Starting your speech in 3, 2, 1. I think this debate is fairly simple, right? OG misses the comparative because they never proved that in the absence of the rights to the IDF, you're going to get public healthcare. I think that's sufficiently explained by OO. OO say that monopoly is a good thing because you get more efficient and cheaper treatment. And then CG say that actually there's a trade-off because every time you're doing economic of scale, you're also like buying into certain harms such as like slightly less competition and stuff like that. On closing up, what we specifically prove to you is not just that like in generically economy of scale is good. We give you two things. Firstly, why data collection that's only possible in big hospitals. It's important for research and development, and that lead to better drugs being developed. But also, I'm going to explain also lead to like better treatment plans. But also, the second point of extension, which I'm applying to data collection, lead to better treatment plans, is also that you simply get better coordinated treatment that are only uniquely important in the setting of a large hospital that you're unlikely to get in small clinic. But firstly, dealing with opening government. I think a lot of opening government's cases are just like somewhat already fall out of this round to the extent that like we're like a bench will always agree that like you're not going to get public health care in absence. So that is the comparative, is that you're comparing small independent clinic to large hospital. So you don't get a lot of the impact that they want to claim. I also just want to add things like a lot of their analysis about why there's going to be competition, and competition like lead to people doing bad things, symmetrically apply to small private clinics. That is, small private clinics are still likely to compete with each other, and in a lot of cases are still going to have bad incentive. But I do want to deal with one piece of material they're left standing, because I think that's somewhat interesting, which they talk about how large regional hospitals have incentive to be politically neutral. That is, they're not going to provide care for politically controversial things such as abortion and stuff like that. I think that's somewhat ridiculous, because if abortion is illegal, nobody's allowed to do abortion. But if abortion is legal, even if you do have IDN, apologies. Even if you have IDN, you're still gonna have specialized small clinic that provides specific kind of care to those kind of things, right? Because you're not directly compete with the IDN in that case. You're not offering the same kind of care. Like you're doing like, okay, we have a clinic specifically offering things such as like AIDS testing to like LGBTQ people, and our care is gonna exist on either side. That is, they don't get anything on that side. And then a lot of things about why monopoly is bad. I think it's like same problem with closing opposition. I'm going to deal with them together. So they tell you about like closing opposition tell you that monopoly is bad, but I think that it's already like very heavily mitigated by Emery when Emery tells you that sure, like you're gonna have like large hospital and like. But there's still gonna be a lot of like incentive as to why you want to do good things. So like even though like sure like you're now having less need to compete, you still have to are hold liable, because first of all you need things such as government cooperation. That is, you cannot be extremely evil, because like you're now a huge regional hospital that like the government is going to like regulate if like a huge amount of patients that which is their constituents and their voters are now saying that this hospital is doing horrible things to me and are like suing you for medical negligence cases. Unlikely that you're going to like want to be extremely evil. I think I'm willing to buy the harm that there's like slightly more capacity for them to like defend against these claims. I think that is somewhat marginal. I think maybe you get changes on that is marginal. But also, if you want to say that they're going to be more efficient in doing bad things, you also have to buy the harm about like why they're going to be more efficient in doing good things, which is the entirety of Emery's case. I think we're going to prove that why we outweigh a lot of like the impact that we get from closing. Not right now. But also, as I already said previously, small clinics have incentive to compete, because I think a lot of their analysis really focus on rural area. We say that in rural areas, a lot of time we also only have like a set amount of people who can support like one local clinic. So in the event I have an independent small clinic in these rural villages instead of like a branch of a large regional hospital, you still have the same incentive of like the all monopolized regional issues that exist. So I'm unclear why things actually get better. I think if anything, you don't get access to the like big hospital have, which is that you have like a standardized treatment plan. You have things such as like standardized resource sharing. You have things such as like procedures that like are followed everywhere. I think the fact that you have like one doctor, you guys probably have less like actual accountability on that end. I'll take 1/2 actually. Sorry.
Your argumentation on efficiency assumes ability, but the most important contribution from OG is that we prove the incentives of the IDNs are there. For example, the incentive to upcharge, the incentive to keep people in the system through administering painkillers, etc.
I already explained to you why a lot of the worst incentives are going to be mitigated, because even though you do have incentive to like compete. I mean, okay. Even though you do have incentive to make profits, first of all, you have to compete with other big regional hospitals. That is to say, the incentive to compete actually make you want to do good things in some instances. Second of all, there are overarching regulatory measures that prevent you from doing the worst kind of things. You have to like actually engage in a clash about why there's actually a trade-off. So moving on then, why would we be opening opposition? I think because they talk about why economy scale is like the good things, and I think they like somewhat explain to you why you get cheaper treatment. But I think we prove to you specifically why this is uniquely important in the medical industry, right? Emery gave you 2 things. Firstly, you get integrated treatment plan, and like because now you have like integrated medical history, you have things such as cooperation among doctors. Why is that uniquely important? The reason why that is important, as Emery explained to you, is because now that people with prolonged medical conditions, they're going to hospitals all the time. People with multiple illnesses, people who are immunocompromised, those people are now being able to access these coordinated treatment plans because they're all in the same places. They have multiple medical conditions that can all get treated together in a holistic manner. So therefore, now you get the best treatment, like at least better treatment for like the most marginalized people while in a compared and small clinic setting. You're unlikely to access that because they have to jump from hospital to hospital and like getting in a car ride, they're like deeply uncomfortable because they can't afford things such as like an ambulance or I don't know. And like all these things are bad. And the response that we get from closing opposition, so I'll take you like
IDNs can't be held accountable because shutting them down is catastrophic, but independent clinics are held accountable by their direct relationships.
I agree. There are other regional hospitals that you have to compete with, and government can regulate. You don't have to just shut them down. You can just have regulatory measures about like, hey, doing that thing is illegal. Like, I'm gonna put you in jail, etc. But lastly, on data, right? I spent too much time. But I think like data, despite the fact that Emery didn't only spend a minute on it, it's actually fairly well proven, and that's also fairly untouched, right? They talk about how like data privacy legislation. I think that's unlikely to actually be a fact. Also, the Emery literally explained to you why these are anonymous data that are being captured by these legislations. I think now you have existing data mean that you get better medical research. Few impact on that. First, having generally more medical research is good, even if like some of those medical research come from pharmaceutical company that may or may not have back incentive. Second of all, you can still share these like data to actually publicly funded like organization because you have incentive to do so, right? You actually want more drugs to be developed because if there are more drugs in the market, it's cheaper for you to buy them. That is crucially important because that, and like big hospitals have huge incentive to actually like want more drugs being developed because that actually help them to like not have to be like strong I don't know what is the word, like pharmaceutical company trying to like blackmail them, whatever. Thank you.